1864, a Confederate artilleryman who fired a cannon that exploded and killed his own gun crew, then was awarded a medal for heroism because no one survived to tell the truth. Sounds like a ghost story, but the truth is just a different kind of quiet. I keep thinking about the way the air tasted that Tuesday, right before the sky turned into a wall of jagged iron and hot, wet silence. My name is Thomas, and I grew up in a place where the biggest problem was whether the tobacco harvest would survive the frost, not whether a shell would turn your best friend into something you couldn't recognize on a Sunday afternoon. I wasn't born for this. I was born for a porch swing in the evening, listening to my father argue with the neighbor about the price of corn, and for the way my girl, Sarah, smelled like honeysuckle and starch when I'd catch her after the church service. We were supposed to get married in the spring. We had a plot of land picked out, a little patch of dirt near the creek that didn't even have a name, but it felt like the center of the world to me. I had plans that were so simple they were practically invisible, the kind of plans that assume the sun is going to rise tomorrow just because it did yesterday. The war wasn't some grand crusade in my head back then. It was just a neighborly obligation that curdled into a nightmare. My brother went first, and then the town started emptying out like a leaking bucket, and you look around and see all those empty chairs at the dinner table, and you realize that if you stay, you're just waiting for your turn to be a memory. I wanted to come home a man who had done his part, someone Sarah could look at and see the weight of the world resting on, and know I'd carried it for her. I remember the morning I signed the papers. The air was crisp. The smell of wood smoke hanging low over the valley, and the ink on the pen felt heavier than a shovel. I thought I knew what courage was. I thought it was a loud noise and a flag and a feeling of being right. I was wrong about all of it. Courage, I found out, is just the ability to keep your heart beating when everything inside you is screaming for it to stop. We were a crew of 5, and I was the one who pulled the lanyard. That's the detail that sticks in my throat like a dry crust of bread. We were positioned on a ridge that looked over a valley of mist, the kind of morning that feels too beautiful for what we were there to do. Jeb was leaning against the wheel of the cannon, picking his teeth with a splinter, laughing about a dog he once had back in Kentucky. He was the kind of man who could make a joke out of a funeral. He looked at me, winked, and said, "Thomas, if we get through this, I'm buying a round of whiskey so strong it'll put hair on your ancestors." We laughed. It was a good laugh, real and deep, the kind of sound that reminds you you're alive. Then the order came down. It wasn't loud, just a flat, clipped voice that didn't know us, didn't care that Jeb had a dog, didn't care that I had a girl waiting in a dress she'd been sewing for months. We loaded that piece, and the iron was cold, biting into my palms. I remember the weight of the rammer, the smell of black powder, that sharp, acrid scent that sticks to your skin like a bad reputation. There's a specific kind of tension in an artillery crew when you know the counter-battery fire is coming. It's not the panic you see in paintings. It's a tightening, a narrowing of the world until you can only see the breach, the fuse, and the back of the man next to you. You stop being a person and you start being a part of a machine that you know is already broken. I checked the primer. I checked it twice, even though I knew it was seated. I looked at Jeb and he gave me a thumbs up, still smiling, still the man who loved his dog, still the man who was going to buy that whiskey. I can still see the flicker of sunlight on his canteen. That was the moment. The light hit the metal and I turned back to the lanyard. The world wasn't a place of politics or principles anymore. It was the heat of the sun on my neck and the vibration of the ground under my boots and the desperate, frantic hope that I wouldn't have to be the one to tell Sarah's father why I came back alone. I loved those men. I don't have a word for it that doesn't sound small. It was a tether, a way of staying connected to a life that was already sliding off the edge of a cliff. We were terrified, every single one of us, but we were terrified together, and that made it something we could manage. We laughed about the food, about the lice, about the officers who couldn't read a map to save their own necks. It was the laughter of men standing on a trapdoor. We'd sit by the fire at night, the embers popping and drifting up toward the stars, and we'd talk about the things we'd do when the war ended, the jobs we'd take, the houses we'd build. It was all a lie, of course, but it was a necessary lie. If we'd stopped believing it for even a minute, we would have walked into the woods and never looked back. The artillery was heavy. It was a beast that demanded everything and gave nothing back. My shoulders burned from the work, and my ears had a constant ringing that felt like a permanent reminder of where I was. I used to close my eyes and try to remember the sound of the creek back home, the way the water rushed over the smooth stones, but the thunder of the guns always drowned it out. Every day felt like a layer of gray paint being applied to my soul. I wasn't the boy who left the porch anymore. I was a man who knew how to calculate the arc of a shell and how to look at a man who was about to die and pretend I didn't see the fear in his eyes. It was a hard pride. The kind that cuts you as you hold it. I was doing my job. I was part of the battery. I was part of the line. The sergeant came over then. He was a man who had seen too much and said too little, a man whose face was a map of every mistake he'd ever made. He He looked at the cannon, then at us, and for a second his eyes lingered on me. There was a question in his gaze, something he didn't voice. I wonder if he knew. I wonder if he could see the hesitation in my hands. That microscopic tremor that comes when your brain tells you to stop but your training tells you to finish. He just nodded, a slow, heavy movement, and walked away toward the command tent. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of ozone and wet earth. I adjusted my cap. The cannon sat there, a black, hulking shape against the horizon, waiting to be fed. Jeb cleared his throat and nudged me with his elbow. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Thomas. Shake it off. We've got a job to do." His voice was steady, normal, the voice of a friend who thought tomorrow was guaranteed. I looked at him, and for a moment I wanted to tell him. I wanted to tell him that the air felt wrong, that the birds had stopped singing, that everything we had built felt like it was about to evaporate. But you don't say those things. You don't take the heart out of a man who is standing on the edge of the fire with you. I just nodded and gripped the lanyard. My knuckles were white. The silence that followed was heavy, a physical weight that sat on my chest, pressing the air out of my lungs. I felt the cold creeping up my legs, even though the sun was still high. I knew that whatever happened next, I wouldn't be the same man on the other side of it. The sergeant turned back from the command tent, his face etched with a grim, final sort of resolve. He didn't look at us this time. He looked at the ridge, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. His posture stiff and unnatural. He seemed like a man waiting for a judgment, or perhaps he was already delivering one. The air grew stiller, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm, where the leaves stop rustling and the very ground beneath your feet seems to hold its breath. I felt a sudden, sharp ache in my chest, a longing for the porch swing, and the smell of honeysuckle that was so intense it made my vision blur. I wanted to reach out and touch the cannon, just to ground myself, but I held my hands at my sides, forcing them to be still. The entire valley seemed to be leaning in, waiting for the sound that would break the silence. I looked at the others, at the faces I had memorized over these long, grinding months. They were just boys, really, regardless of the beards or the dirt or the hardness in their eyes. They were boys who wanted to go home and kiss their sweethearts and walk behind a plow. And there I was, holding the tether that linked them to the abyss. The realization hit me then, not as a thought, but as a visceral certainty, a cold shiver that traveled up my spine and settled in my marrow. It wasn't the enemy that was the danger. It was the mechanism, the intent, the cold, uncaring math of war that turned men into targets and mistakes into history. I felt a tear track through the dust on my cheek, and I quickly wiped it away, hoping no one had seen. I couldn't be the one to break. Not now. The sergeant raised his arm, his hand trembling just a fraction. It was a subtle thing, something only a man who had been watching him for months would notice, but it spoke volumes. He was a man who had spent his life giving orders that he knew would lead to ruin, and he was tired. I could see the fatigue in the slump of his shoulders, in the way he stood, as if he were trying to bear the weight of all those we had already lost. He dropped his hand. The command was given. It was a single word, sharp and final, cutting through the silence like a blade. I didn't think, I didn't pray, I didn't even breathe. I just pulled. The lanyard was taut, the spring clicked, and the world began its final tilt. My heart felt like it was thumping in my throat, a frantic trapped bird, and I closed my eyes for the split second before the hammer fell, wishing just for a moment that I was anywhere else, that I was anyone else, that I was the boy on the porch waiting for the sun to rise on a life that had never known the taste of ash. I heard the primer snap, a small, innocent sound that promised the end of everything, and I held my breath, waiting for the sky to fall. The sound didn't come in a roar like I expected. It came in a sickening, wet crack, the kind of sound a dry branch makes when it snaps under a heavy boot, only multiplied 1,000 times and turned into metal. The cannon didn't fire out toward the enemy line. It shuddered, a deep, guttural groan that vibrated up through my boots and settled into my teeth, and then the world simply ceased to be a place where logic lived. A wave of heat hit me, not the warm heat of a summer noon, but a sharp, biting blast that smelled like scorched copper and torn earth. I was thrown backward, the air kicked out of my lungs, and for a long, floating heartbeat, I was suspended in a vacuum where the only thing that existed was the ringing in my ears and the sight of the sun spinning in a sky that had gone a bruised, sickly purple. I landed hard, the back of my head catching a rock, and the world went gray at the edges, dimming like a lantern running low on oil. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like someone had parked a wagon on it. I forced my eyes open, blinking through a veil of dust and fine, floating particles that looked like ash. The first thing I saw was the sky, clear and indifferent, and then slowly, the scene started to knit itself back together in a horrific, high-definition clarity. The gun carriage was mangled, twisted inward as if a giant hand had reached down and crumpled it like a discarded letter. The ground around it was torn up, a jagged crater where there had been firm grass just a moment ago, and then I saw them. Jeb was the first one I looked for. He wasn't leaning on the wheel anymore. He was 10 feet away, sprawled in the tall grass, his back turned to me. For a second, I felt a surge of relief, a stupid, reflexive hope that he was just stunned, that he was about to stand up and crack a joke about how clumsy we were. I tried to shout his name, but only a wheezing, thin sound came out of my throat. I pushed myself up, my hand sliding in something slick and warm that I refused to acknowledge as I scrambled toward him. My knees were shaking so hard I couldn't keep my balance, and I kept falling, crawling the last few feet. When I got to him, I reached out to touch his shoulder, to shake him, to make him turn around and look at me with those damn twinkling eyes. I grabbed his shoulder and pulled. He didn't offer any resistance. He turned and I saw his face. It wasn't Jeb. It was a mask of ruin, his features smoothed over by the blast, his expression frozen in a look of profound, quiet surprise. There was no pain in it, just an absolute, final stillness. I didn't scream, I couldn't. I just sat there, my hands covered in his blood, looking at him while the world kept spinning, indifferent to the fact that the man who had been talking about his dog 5 minutes ago was now just a collection of cooling parts. I felt a strange, cold detachment, the kind that happens when your mind refuses to accept a truth too big to hold. I looked at my hands. They were stained, dark, and heavy, and I realized then that the metallic smell wasn't just the cannon, it was him. The silence that followed was worse than the explosion. It wasn't quiet. It was filled with the sounds of the living, or what was left of us. Over near the remains of the gun, another man was making a sound like a wounded animal, a rhythmic, guttural sobbing that didn't stop, a sound that grated against the nerves. I looked over. It was Miller. He was clutching his leg, his face buried in the dirt, rocking back and forth. I should have gone to him. I knew I should have moved, should have crawled over and helped him with the tourniquet, but I couldn't move my legs. I was paralyzed by the weight of the realization that I was the only one standing, the only one who had been holding the lanyard when it happened. The math was simple, and it was devastating. I had been the trigger. I looked back at the sky. It was still that same beautiful, clear blue. How could the sky stay the same? How could the birds keep singing in the tree line? I felt a sudden, sharp spike of anger, hot and irrational. I wanted to stand up and scream at the trees, at the sun, at the very dirt for allowing this to happen. I wanted to drag Jeb back to his feet and make him finish the story about the dog. The absurdity of it hit me then. The dog didn't matter. The whiskey didn't matter. The spring wedding in the patch of dirt by the creek felt like a story I had read in a book a lifetime ago, a story about a different boy, a stranger who didn't know what it felt like to have his friend's life coating his palms. I don't know how long I sat there. The time blurred, shifting into a haze where I was both hyper-aware of every ant crawling on a blade of grass and completely blind to the world around me. The sergeant finally emerged from the smoke, his face a gray slate of shock. He walked toward us, his boots crunching on the gravel, a rhythmic, steady sound that seemed to mock the chaos. He didn't look at the carnage at first. He walked to the gun, touched the twisted metal, and then he looked at me. His eyes were dead. There was nothing behind them, no pity, no blame, no humanity. He looked like a statue carved out of granite. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. He just looked at the wreckage and then at the bodies, and he turned away, his shoulders slumping as if he had just realized he had no more orders left to give. "Get them moved," he said, his voice flat, completely devoid of inflection. "Clear the road. We move in 10 minutes. I stared at him. I wanted to tell him that Jeb was right here, that we couldn't just move, that we needed a moment to breathe, to understand, to cry. But the words died in my throat. I watched the other men from the battery begin to stir, moving like ghosts, their faces hollowed out, their eyes avoiding the ground. They were efficient. They were disciplined. They were monsters. I stood up, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else, and I walked over to where they were beginning to stack the debris. I didn't help. I just stood there, watching them treat the bodies with the same clinical indifference they used to stack crates of ammunition. It was the most horrifying thing I had ever seen. One of the men, a kid we called Kid because he was barely 19, looked up at me. His uniform was torn and there was a streak of blood across his forehead. He didn't say anything, but he looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw the same mirror of my own ruin. We were both walking dead men. We had died right there on that ridge, and the versions of us that were left were just shells, going through the motions until the war decided to finish the job. He looked away, back to his task, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to reach out and pull him back, to tell him that we didn't have to do this, that we could just walk into the woods and keep walking until the world ended. But I didn't. I just stood there, my hands hanging at my sides, watching the sun climb higher, baking the smell of the carnage into the soil. The afternoon crawled by in a blur of forced movement. We had to prepare the new battery position, lugging heavy shells across the uneven ground, the weight of the iron digging into our shoulders, biting into our flesh. Every time I lifted around, I thought about Jeb, about how he had laughed while he worked. Now there was no laughter. There was only the sound of heavy breathing and the dull thud of metal hitting wooden crates. The sergeant watched us with those dead, shark-like eyes, never offering a word, never showing a sign of the man he had been that morning. We were machines now, cold, broken, efficient machines. I remember the water. It was late afternoon, and I was so thirsty my tongue felt like a piece of sandpaper in my mouth. I went to the water barrel, dipping a tin cup into the lukewarm, metallic-tasting water. I raised it to my lips, but then I stopped. I could see my own reflection in the water, a gaunt, hollow-eyed stranger, covered in dust and dried, crusted blood. I didn't recognize the face. I wanted to splash the water on my face, to wash away the ghost, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The water was for the living, and I didn't feel like I belonged to that group anymore. I dropped the cup, letting it clatter to the ground, and walked back to the gun. The night was the worst. We didn't have a fire. The order had come down to keep silent, to stay in the shadows, waiting for the dawn that would bring the next round of fire. I sat with my back against a tree, my knees pulled to my chest, watching the stars. They were indifferent, cold, sparkling points of light that didn't care about the carnage on the ridge. I kept thinking about Sarah. I tried to conjure her face, to remember the specific shade of her hair in the morning light, but it was fading. The memory was being crowded out, replaced by the smell of the powder and the look on Jeb's face. I realized then that I wasn't just losing the men, I was losing the person I was before. I was becoming the war, and the war was becoming me. I closed my eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. What could I ask for? Could I ask for mercy when I was the one who pulled the lanyard? Could I ask for forgiveness when I had already committed the ultimate sin? I didn't pray. I just sat there, waiting for the dark to consume me. Around midnight, I heard someone crying. It was the kid. He was huddled a few feet away, his body shaking with suppressed sobs. I wanted to go to him to comfort him, but I was afraid. I was afraid that if I touched him, if I tried to share the weight, we would both collapse and never get up. I remained still, listening to his quiet, broken sounds, a rhythm that echoed the beating of my own shattered heart. We were all alone, even here in the middle of a group of men. We were islands of grief, drifting in a sea of blood. The next morning, we moved again. The battery was pulled forward, the horses straining against the harnesses, their sides heaving with the effort. I walked behind the caisson, my eyes on the ground, watching the tracks left by the wheels in the mud. They were deep, carving a path through the earth, a permanent record of our passage. I wondered if anyone would ever see them, if they would ever look at these tracks and know that men had been here, that they had lived and that they had died. I doubted it. The war would wash over this land, burying our history under layers of earth and time, until the only thing left of us would be the silence we had created. We reached the new position by midday. It was a valley, low and swampy, with high ridges on either side. We set up the guns, digging the pits, bracing the trails, all in a haze of mindless, repetitive motion. The sergeant walked among us, his presence a constant. Heavy pressure. He didn't speak to me, and I didn't look at him. I just did what I was told, my hands working the rammer, my feet planting themselves in the soft, yielding mud. I was a puppet, my strings being pulled by a force I couldn't see, moving toward an end I couldn't predict. The shelling started in the afternoon. It wasn't our guns this time, it was theirs. The first round landed 100 yards away, throwing up a geyser of mud and trees, then another closer. The ground began to shake, a rhythmic pounding vibration that rattled the very bones in my body. We dove for cover, pressing our faces into the wet earth, the smell of sulfur and ozone filling my nose. This was the fear I had imagined before I enlisted, the terror of being hunted, of being trapped in a cage while something larger and more powerful tore it apart. But it was different than I thought. It wasn't chaotic. It was orderly, methodical. The work of a professional army that knew exactly where we were and exactly how to destroy us. I looked over at the kid. He was pressed into the mud, his hands over his head, his eyes wide and vacant. I crawled over to him, grabbing his arm and pulling him into a deeper depression in the earth. He didn't resist. He just looked at me, a blank, hollow stare that said he had gone somewhere else, somewhere where the shells couldn't reach him. I held onto his arm, my fingers digging into his sleeve, trying to ground him, to bring him back, but he was gone. He was just a body, waiting to be claimed by the next strike. The shelling continued for hours. It was a relentless, grinding pressure, a war of attrition where the only thing that mattered was who could survive the longest. We waited, our hearts thumping against the mud, our breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. I thought about the porch back home, about the way the light hit the floorboards in the afternoon. I tried to focus on that image, to use it as a shield, but the thunder of the shells kept breaking through, shattering the image, scattering it like dry leaves in a windstorm. When the shelling finally stopped, the silence that followed was heavy, a suffocating weight that pressed down on us. I raised my head, looking around the valley. It was a scene of desolation, the trees stripped of their branches, the ground churned up and pockmarked with craters. A few of the men were starting to crawl out of their holes, their faces masked with dust, their eyes searching the horizon. We were still alive, I don't know why. It felt like a mistake, a clerical error in the grand accounting of the war. I walked over to the gun pit. The The cannon was still there, a black, silent sentry in the middle of the wreckage. I reached out and touched the barrel, expecting it to be hot, but it was cold, covered in a fine layer of grit and grime. It was a neutral object, a piece of engineering that didn't know the grief it had caused, the lives it had ended. It was just a tool, and I was the one who had used it. That realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had done this. I had been the one to pull the lanyard, and now I was the one who had to live with the consequences. The sergeant came over, his face still that same gray slate of indifference. He looked at the gun, then at me. "Get it ready," he said. His voice didn't waver. He didn't even blink. He might have been asking for a cup of coffee. I looked at the gun, then back at him. I wanted to tell him that I couldn't do it, that I was done, that I couldn't pull the lanyard ever again. But the words were frozen, trapped behind a wall of numbness that had settled in my heart. I just nodded, turning back to the gun. I was a machine, and machines don't have a choice. I started to load the piece, my hands moving with a practiced, automatic rhythm. I didn't think about the work. I didn't think about the war. I just focused on the weight of the shell, the way it felt in my arms, the cold, hard reality of the iron. I was a part of the battery, a cog in the machine, and I would keep turning until the machine stopped or until it broke me completely. I didn't care anymore. I had nothing left to lose. My friends were dead, my future was a memory, and my soul was a scorched, barren landscape. The sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley. The sky turned a deep blood red, the color of the earth beneath my feet. It was a beautiful, terrifying sight, a reflection of the violence we had inflicted on this place. I watched the light fade, feeling the cold air settle over the valley, a thin, biting mist that crept along the ground. We were alone, a small, broken crew in a dark, empty valley, waiting for the night to finish what the day had started. I found a piece of hardtack in my pocket, stale and dry, and I chewed on it, the taste of nothingness filling my mouth. It didn't matter. Everything tasted like ash. I watched the stars start to emerge, one by one, cold and distant. They were the same stars that shone down on the porch back home, but they looked different here, stripped of their wonder, reduced to navigation points in a landscape of death. I looked up at them, feeling a sudden, sharp ache in my chest, a longing for the world I had left behind, a world that felt like a dream I had woken up from long ago. I don't know how long I sat there, watching the stars. It could have been minutes, it could have been years. The time had lost its meaning, turned into a static, unchanging state of existence. I was here, and I was going to be here until the end. That was the only truth I had left. I lay back on the ground, the cold, wet soil seeping through my uniform, and closed my eyes. I didn't sleep. I just drifted, waiting for the dawn, waiting for the next order, waiting for the end of the world. A shadow fell over me, and I opened my eyes. It was the sergeant. He was looking down at me, his face still that unreadable, hollow mask. "Get some sleep," he said, his voice flat and monotone. "We march at dawn." He turned and walked away, his boots disappearing into the dark. I didn't move. I just lay there, looking at the stars, feeling the weight of the earth pressing down on me. I was alone, and yet I was surrounded by the dead. I thought about Jeb's dog. I tried to remember the name he had told me that day on the ridge, but it was gone, lost in the roar of the explosion. The memory was a ghost, a flicker of light in the darkness, and it was fading, replaced by the relentless, grinding reality of the war. I felt a tear track through the dust on my cheek, but I didn't wipe it away. I let it fall, a small, insignificant drop of water in an ocean of grief. I was still here. That was the most terrifying realization of all. I had survived, and the cost of that survival was everything that had made me a human being. I was a shell, a hollow, empty vessel, waiting to be filled with the next tragedy. I closed my eyes again, the darkness pressing in on me, a heavy, suffocating blanket that offered no comfort, no rest. The wind picked up, a low, moaning sound that moved through the trees. A ghostly, mournful cry that seemed to lament everything we had lost. I listened to it, the sound of the world mourning the dead, and I felt a strange, cold peace. It didn't matter anymore. The grief, the guilt, the fear, it was all just noise in the silence of the night. I was a part of the land now, a feature of the terrain, as indifferent and as broken as the valley itself. I don't know what happened to the others. I didn't look. I didn't care. I was the only one who mattered, the only one who was left to carry the weight of what we had done. I lay there, the cold seeping into my marrow, and for the first time since the explosion, I felt nothing. No pain, no anger, no sorrow. Just a cold, empty void, a space where my heart used to be. The night stretched on, a long, endless corridor of darkness. I waited, my eyes wide, watching the sky, waiting for the first sign of light, for the morning that would bring the next turn of the screw. I was a soldier, and I would do my duty, even if it meant destroying everything I ever loved. The irony wasn't lost on me. It was just a detail, a small, insignificant fact in the grand design of the war. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the photograph of Sarah I had kept there. It was worn, the corners soft and frayed, but I didn't take it out. I didn't need to. I knew what it looked like. I knew what it meant. and I knew that it was no longer a part of me. That life, that boy, that future, they were gone, buried under the rubble of the ridge, and the man who was left was something else entirely. The first gray light of dawn began to creep along the horizon, a slow, pale smudge against the darkness. I stood up, my body stiff and aching, the cold air biting at my skin. The camp was stirring, the men moving with a slow, heavy gait, their faces hollow and gray in the dim light. We were ghosts, all of us, living in the space between the living and the dead. I walked over to the gun, my boots heavy in the mud. I grabbed the rammer, the wood worn smooth by my hands, and I started to prep the carriage. It was time. The machine was waking up, and it needed to be fed. I looked at the horizon, at the mist rising from the valley, and I felt a strange, detached curiosity. What would today bring? What new horror was waiting to be unleashed? It didn't matter. I was ready. I was a part of the battery, and the battery was my life, my world, my only remaining truth. I pulled the lanyard, the spring clicked, and the world began its final, inevitable descent into the abyss. I didn't look back, I didn't pray. I just stood there, watching the shell arc through the morning air, a tiny, dark speck against the gray sky, a promise of the end that was coming for us all. I was the one who pulled it. I was the one who was responsible. And as I watched the flash in the distance, a small, silent plume of smoke, I knew that this was my reality now, and there was no going back. The cycle was complete, the machine was running, and I was its heart, beating with the rhythm of destruction, moving toward an end I couldn't change. And for the first time, I didn't want to. I leaned against the cannon, the cold steel biting into my shoulder. The air around me was still, held in a fragile, temporary balance. I felt the vibration of the ground beneath my feet, a low, humming frequency that seemed to permeate everything. It was the sound of the war, the heartbeat of the land, a constant, underlying pulse that had replaced the rhythm of my own life. I looked at the sergeant. He was standing a few feet away, his back to me, looking out toward the enemy line. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, a stone monolith in the middle of the desolation. We were two of a kind, he and I, men who had seen too much and had nothing left to say. The silence between us was profound, a chasm that neither of us could bridge, and for a moment I felt a strange, bitter kinship with him. We were the guardians of the end, the keepers of the ruin. A bird sang in the distance, a sharp, clear note that seemed out of place in this graveyard of iron and earth. I listened to it, the sound cutting through the thick, heavy air, and I felt a brief, sharp pang of longing. How could the world be so cruel, so beautiful, so indifferent? I looked at the sky, the pale blue of morning, and I wanted to scream, to weep, to tear the very fabric of existence apart. But I didn't. I just stood there, the weight of the cannon beneath my hand, a silent, unmoving witness to the tragedy we had created. The sergeant turned and looked at me. His eyes were still empty, still cold, but there was a flicker of something, a hint of recognition. As if he knew exactly what I was feeling, what I had become. He didn't say a word. He just nodded, a slow, heavy motion, and then he turned back to the horizon. It was a sign, a confirmation of our shared secret, our mutual, unspoken pact. We were in this together, bound by the horror of what we had done, by the memory of the dead, and by the inevitable, approaching end. I turned back to the gun. There was work to be done. We had to prepare for the next round, to load the iron, to prime the fuse, to wait for the next order. It was the only way to keep the numbness at bay, to keep the void from consuming us entirely. I moved with a mechanical precision, my hands working the metal, my body a tool of the battery, a gear in the machine that never stopped turning. The valley was filling with light now, the mist burning off, revealing the true extent of the carnage. Bodies lay scattered across the mud, a macabre mosaic of the war's work. I didn't look at them. I kept my eyes on the gun, on the breech, on the rammer, on the task at hand. I was a soldier, a patriot, a hero, that's what they called us. What they wrote in the papers back home. But here in the cold, wet mud, none of that mattered. We were just men, destroyed and breaking, waiting for the final word that would turn us into memories. I felt a sudden, sharp ache in my chest, a memory of Sarah's touch, the smell of honeysuckle in the air. I closed my eyes, trying to catch the scent, but it was gone, lost in the smell of burning powder and wet, churned earth. The memory was a ghost, a flicker of light in the darkness, and it was fading, replaced by the relentless, grinding reality of the war. I was a shell, a hollow, empty vessel, and I was going to carry this weight for the rest of my life, a burden that no one would ever understand, a secret that would define everything I would ever do, ever feel, ever be. The sergeant called out an order, his voice cutting through the silence like a whip. It was time. I grabbed the rammer. The wood familiar and cold, and I stepped up to the breach. The machine was ready, and I was the trigger, the conduit for the violence, the source of the end. I didn't think about the past, about the boy on the porch, about the wedding in the spring. I didn't think about Jeb or the dog or the laughter that had defined our lives. I didn't think about the cost. I just pulled the lanyard, the spring clicked, and the world once again gave way to the fire, the thunder, and the silence. I stood there watching the smoke drift across the valley, a shroud for the lost, a testament to the destruction, and for the first time I understood what it meant to be a man at war, to be the one who does the thing that can never be undone, and to live with the knowledge of that forever. The air was thick with smoke, gray and acrid, clinging to my skin, my clothes, my lungs. It was the taste of the truth, the metallic, burning taste of everything I had destroyed. I didn't move. I stood there, the lanyard still in my hand, watching the smoke swirl in the morning air, a spectral dance of the ghosts we had created. I felt a strange, cold detachment, a profound sense of isolation, as if I were looking at the world from the other side of a glass wall. Everything was happening, but it was happening to someone else, to a stranger I didn't recognize. The sergeant walked over, his boots crunching on the shells of the spent ammunition. He looked at me, his eyes searching, trying to find something, to read the depth of my emptiness. But he wouldn't find anything. There was nothing left to find. We were the same, he and I, two hollow men in a world of ghosts. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement, and he reached out, placing a hand on my shoulder. It was a heavy, calloused hand, a weight that felt like the entire history of the war, a reminder of the bond that existed between us, the bond of the destroyed, the brotherhood of the lost. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. We were connected by the horror, by the memory of the ridge, by the knowledge of what we had done, and by the shared reality of our existence. We were soldiers, and we were done. We had fulfilled our duty, paid our debt, and now we were just waiting for the final, concluding act. I looked at him, at the map of his mistakes, at the lines of his grief, and I felt a sudden, sharp surge of gratitude. He understood, he knew, he was there. We were in this together, and as long as I had him, as long as we were standing here in the cold, wet mud of the valley, I wasn't entirely alone. We were the keepers of the ruin, the stewards of the silence, and we would continue, we would work, we would exist, until the day that we too were reclaimed by the earth. I dropped the lanyard, the metal ringing against the carriage, a small, final sound that resonated in the air. I walked over to the supply crates. My movements slow and deliberate, the weight of the war in every step. I was done. I had done my part, and now it was time for the next act. I didn't look back at the gun, at the ridge, at the valley, or at the faces of the others. I was focused on the task, on the present, on the cold, hard reality of the day. We were soldiers, and we had done what was asked of us. We had fought, we had suffered, we had destroyed, and we had survived. And that was the truth of it, the cold, hard, inescapable truth that would live with us until our dying day. I reached for the next shell, the cold iron biting into my palms, and I began the cycle again, the work of the machine, the rhythm of the war, the endless grinding motion that would lead us to the end. I was the trigger, the catalyst, the source of the ruin, and I would continue, I would persist. I would be the soldier I was meant to be, right until the final, concluding moment. The flight home was not the grand parade I had imagined when I was sitting on my mother's front porch back in Ohio. It was 18 hours of pressurized silence in a metal tube, surrounded by men who were all doing the exact same thing, staring at the seat back in front of them, trying to remember how to breathe without checking for incoming fire. We didn't talk. We didn't exchange contact information. We were like survivors of a shipwreck who had landed on different shores and realized we had nothing left to say to one another because the language we had learned together didn't exist in the civilian world. I spent most of the flight staring out the tiny window, watching the clouds roll by, and I couldn't stop seeing Jeb's face. Not the ruined face from the end, but the face from the beginning, the way he looked when he was laughing at a stupid joke about his dog. It was like a film loop playing behind my eyelids, over and over, frame by frame, until the edges of the memory started to fray. I was terrified. I wasn't afraid of the war anymore. I was afraid of the porch. I was afraid of the kitchen table. I was afraid of my own front door because I knew that when I stepped through it, I would be a lie. I was a dead man wearing a uniform, pretending to be the boy who had left, and the prospect of the performance was exhausting. The reunion was a blur of fluorescent lights and shaking hands. I remember walking through the terminal, my duffel bag feeling like it was filled with lead, and then I saw her. She was standing by the gate, her hands clutched tightly in front of her, her face a mask of hope and terror. When she saw me, she ran, and for a moment I felt a spark of the old life, a flicker of warmth that hadn't been touched by the cold void. She threw her arms around me, burying her face in my shoulder, and I hugged her back, but it felt wrong. It felt like I was hugging her through a thick sheet of glass. I was there, but I was also still on the ridge, my hands still covered in the heat of that day. That night, lying in my own bed, the silence of the house was louder than any explosion. I couldn't sleep. The air felt too clean, too still, too safe. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whistle of a shell or the snap of a trigger, and I would jerk awake, my heart hammering against my ribs, gasping for air that didn't smell like sulfur. The first morning, I went into the kitchen to make coffee, and I found myself standing in the center of the room, listening to the house settle, terrified that someone was going to walk through the back door and start firing. I stayed like that for an hour, just standing in the quiet, and when my wife came in, she didn't ask what was wrong. She just looked at me, and in her eyes, I saw the reflection of the stranger I had become. She didn't say anything, but she walked over and placed a hand on my arm, and I flinched. That was the moment I knew. I was home, but I wasn't back. The months that followed were a long, slow grind of trying to disappear into a life I no longer recognized. I got a job at a warehouse, moving boxes, because the physical labor kept my hands busy and my mind from wandering into the dark. People would ask me what it was like, and I would tell them the sanitized version, the boring bits about the heat and the food, and they would nod, satisfied, as if they actually understood. I learned to laugh at the right times, to mimic the social cues of a man who hadn't seen the world come apart, but it was all an act. I went to the VA, sitting in that beige room with the flickering lights, waiting for someone to give me a key to unlock the cage I was living in. The counselor was a good man, I think, but he didn't know. He spoke in textbooks and theories, and I listened, nodding, knowing that he would never understand the specific, cold, metallic smell of that day on the ridge. I stopped going after the third visit. It wasn't his fault, it was mine. I didn't want to be fixed. I wanted to be whole again, and there was no medicine for the loss of a soul. There was a dinner party at my sister's house 6 months later. Everyone was laughing, the smell of roast beef filling the room, the sound of music playing on the radio. It was a perfect, normal American night. I was sitting at the table, a plate in front of me, and someone made a joke. And I started to laugh. It was a genuine laugh, a break in the clouds, and for a second I felt like the boy who had left for the war. But then mid-laugh I stopped. The sound of the laughter sounded like a gunshot in my ears, and I looked around the room, seeing all these people who had no idea what the world was really capable of, and I felt a sudden, crushing wave of guilt. I had no right to be laughing. I had no right to be sitting here, eating dinner, drinking beer, pretending that the world was a safe, predictable place. I stood up, excused myself, and went out to the porch. I sat on the swing, looking out at the dark backyard, and I cried. I didn't sob, I just let the tears fall, a slow, quiet rain of all the things I had kept inside. I was tired, so tired, and for the first time I realized that I wasn't going to get back to who I was. I was going to have to learn to live with the man I had become, the man who had survived the ruin. It's been years now. The nightmares have gotten quieter, the flinching has mostly stopped, and I don't check under the car as often as I used to. I've learned to manage the silence. I've learned to find the small, specific things that keep me tied to the earth, the way the light hits the driveway in the morning, the feeling of the wood grain under my hands when I'm working on a project, the sound of my wife's voice when she calls me from the other room. I don't look for redemption anymore. I don't think it's possible. What I look for is peace, a small, quiet space where I can exist without the weight of the ridge pressing down on my chest every single second of every single day. I've come to understand that the horror and the hope can exist in the same person, that they aren't enemies but two sides of the same coin. I survived, and that is a truth I have to carry, not as a badge of honor, but as a responsibility. I don't talk about it much, except for nights like this. When the coffee is cold and the house is still, and I need to remind myself that I was actually there, that it really happened. I'm standing in my garage now. It's about 3 in the morning. I'm working on an old engine I picked up at a scrapyard, the grease staining my knuckles, the smell of oil and iron comforting in a way I can't explain. It's quiet, just the hum of the overhead light and the rhythmic ticking of the cooling metal. I'm not thinking about the war. I'm thinking about the way the cylinder head fits onto the block, the precise, mechanical satisfaction of making something work again. It's not the life I thought I was going to have, but it's a life. It's real and it's mine, and I'm still here. I look at my hands in the light, the scars and the calluses, and I don't see the ruin anymore. I see a survivor. I see a man who went through the fire and didn't burn to ash. I have hope, quiet and specific, like a small, steady flame in a dark room. It's not the bright, burning hope of a boy, but it's enough to keep me standing. The engine is almost ready to turn over, and I know that when I hit that switch, it's going to hum, a steady, rhythmic sound that will fill this space and anchor me to the ground. That's enough for tonight. That's enough for now. The world is out there, indifferent and beautiful and terrifying, but in here, for this one moment, everything is exactly where it needs to be. I take a sip of the cold coffee, set the cup down on the workbench, and reach for the wrench. I still have work to do.